I now welcome comments and questions from the audience. If you'd like to go to the podium or to the microphone. Yes, please come up. My apologies. And just a reminder from yesterday, if you could please state your name and affiliation, and if you have a specific speaker for which you'd like to address your question.
Thank you. Adam Drunowski, University of Washington. I have a question and a comment from Nicole. I'm thrilled that you mentioned transportation, an underappreciated component of nutritional science. So I have a question and calculation for you. Suppose that you have a city of 20 million people, each of whom is eating a diet of 2,000 calories. And suppose they eat a diet of nourishing broccoli, leafy greens, baby carrots, and other vegetables. Average energy density, 1/2 calorie per gram, meaning that you have 80,000 tons of food, moving through city streets every day, maybe even more, given loss and waste of fresh produce. 100,000 tons every day to be delivered to the people. And suppose that the same population switches to a diet of processed foods or ultra-processed foods, chocolate, potato chips, energy density 5 calories per gram. Suddenly your transportation costs go down to 8,000 tons per day. So as a result, your transportation costs are cut by 1/10. And of course, the energy-dense foods are cheaper. So what does it mean in terms of how it's going to play out economically in the long term? You're really reducing your transportation costs by 9/10. My fear is that for big cities, many of them poor, there are going to be incredible economic pressures to eat energy-dense diets, which are cheap but nutrient-poor. How is it going to play out?
Wow, interesting question. I think, so the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions that I showed you was for average diets. And on average, we don't consume a lot of fruits and vegetables. But the difference between the transportation impact in a fruit and vegetable supply chain versus processed foods, it's not an order of magnitude different. It's let's say it depends on how they're transported. So if you're air freighting fruits and vegetables in, of course you would have a much larger environmental impact. But if those fruits and vegetables are being transported on fully loaded trucks, it's not going to have it's not going to compare to the impacts of production. So I still think, that's like a hypothetical thought experiment that we'll never get to. So I still think that the over-focus on food miles is not warranted. Of course, we need to worry about efficiency in transportation, but I'm not entirely sure how to answer your question, Adam. I think is what I'm getting at. Okay.
I think that weight of food is absolutely the appropriate metric for transportation because, we transport food by weight. But the weight of food is not appropriate metric for diets because we don't carry food, we eat it. So the weight of food is actually immaterial. It's really all about calories and nutrients. So why are you using greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food, which actually doesn't make much sense?
Largely just because we have intake from what people say they're eating on a weight basis. So it's merely a avenue for linking those two. I agree, it's not the best metric for comparing different foods, but then again, neither is caloric content, because then you get situations where lettuce has a larger greenhouse gas emission impact than pork does, and that's fairly illogical as well.
Say, because as I say, there are no requirements for weight of food to be consumed daily, but we need approximately 2,000 calories and certain nutrients. So I actually would peg the greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental footprint to the energy requirements and needs and not purely to the weight of what we consume. This is again the energy, the energy density comes in big time.
Adam, if you are talking about a healthy diet, we consume a much smaller quantity of calories from fruits and vegetables. So if you think about it in the context of a diet pattern, where I do think it makes sense to use a calorie comparison for the status of for the diet pattern basis, it makes more sense. But at the level of foods, it skews. I mean, I think Marty and I just kind of disagree with you on that.
So, Dr. Janowski, I know you've generated an interesting topic because the line has grown exponentially since you've been at the microphone. So I'm going to move on. Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I want to use the point that you mentioned. I want to ask whether you can explain it more. Let's say from the population, now currently China eliminated one-child policy, now changed it to two-child policy. So I wonder how do they affect the population and eventually affect our environment and food. And second is whether the warmer, maybe you say a lot of vitamin, whether you use vitamin is better and cheaper and maybe more efficient in terms of environment. And then the third will be like our system send a lot of people to jail, but jail condition is very poor. They affect people's health, and then eventually that will be cost more in terms of health care and in terms of food. Whether you have a study, whether the food eventually that costs more or medicine that costs more. So whether you can explain all this directly and indirectly.
Thank you for your questions.
I volunteer answering the first one. The lifting of the one-child policy in China will, in my opinion, not make a huge difference because the vast majority of Chinese families still decide to stay with one child because of expenses related to larger families. What drives the population structure of China much more than number of kids is the increasing life expectancy that we have seen over the last 20, 30 years. The average Chinese lives much longer today than he or she lived 20, 30 years ago, and that cumulatively has a big impact on total population density in China.
Anything else?
Good morning, Regina Tan from the Department of Agriculture. I want to thank the Planning Committee as well as the panel for the excellent presentations. I have a question for Frank, and it's regarding the differences in footprints by breed. For example, I'd expect a Jersey versus a Holstein to have a different pattern. Second to that, any efforts to share breeding stock internationally, as well as then finally improve veterinary infrastructure.
So the first question with respect to differences in breed, in general, yes, there are significant differences in breed. Some are more efficient than others. For example, a smaller framed Jersey will be more efficient in producing milk than a larger framed Holstein. There's no question about differences in breed. There's also no question that globally we have to trade livestock in order to get more efficient breeds, but that are still appropriately adopted to the region they're going to those regions. For example, we don't want to have China only receiving the bottom quarter or so of the breeding herd, but we want them to have good quality animals so that they produce efficiently. Currently, that's not happening. It could. The veterinary system is largely underdeveloped in much of the particularly developing world, where livestock is oftentimes infested with parasites. These parasites then consume the nutrients that we really want to provide to the livestock, and that's a grave concern because animals are not treated appropriately, oftentimes not vaccinated, and that leads to enormous production losses, driving environmental impact. A lot needs to be done, but now we know what should be done. The question is, are we ready for a new green revolution?
Dr. Laurie.
Yeah, hi, Peter Lurie, Center for Science and the Public Interest. I'm new to the Food Forum, and I don't really know what your policies are, but I'd like to propose that a standard policy be that all speakers disclose their conflict of interest as part of their speech. And I'd like to also propose that we start implementing that right now. I don't think Dr. Denniston needs to disclose, because that's quite clear. And Dr. Heller, you were quite clear. Very good. But Dr. Mitloehner and Dr. First and Dr. Blackstone, I'm wondering if there are any conflicts you'd like to disclose.
Conflicts with respect to financial conflicts? Or?
With respect to the funding of research over the years.
About 98% of my funding comes from public sources. That includes EPA and Air Resources Board and agricultural departments. 2% comes from companies that fund, let's say, technology research into mitigation of emissions, and that's my total funding.
Companies would be?
Elanco, pharmaceutical companies that have, for example, food additives to offer that reduce greenhouse gases. They are at the forefront of developing technologies that help you reduce environmental footprint.
Dr. Blackstone?
Yeah, and my funding has been entirely from my institutions, my academic institutions, and an environmental leadership foundation.
So hard. Thanks. Let's do that from now on.
Good morning. My name's Jackie Schultz. I work at Kraft Heinz, also a former UC Davis grad. So just wanted to ask Dr. Mitloehner, I found your presentation very compelling. And, you know, as a dietitian, I feel there's a lot of benefit, obviously, to dietary shifts from the standpoint of chronic disease risk reduction, et cetera. I don't know if anybody went to IFT and saw Dennis Dimmock's presentation. He has Eyes on Earth. It was just extremely impressive in terms of the urgency of the climate change crisis that we're obviously all well aware of. But I just wanted to ask maybe a provocative question from your perspective, and obviously any others on the panel, in terms of when we're looking at dietary shifts and addressing this urgent climate change concern. Are dietary shifts, while they obviously have some potential benefits here, are they enough to really move the needle as quickly as we need it to? Or are things, or in addition, is our focus area on fossil fuel risk reduction, fossil fuel use reduction and food waste going to have more of an impact more quickly, in addition to obviously focusing in on nutrition?
So, was the question addressed to me or to everybody?
If you're able to start, sure.
Okay. So in my opinion, dietary changes will occur, but they will occur slowly. In many regions of the world, they will occur in ways that many people in the room don't favor, meaning a shift of a more animal-based diet will occur in much of the developing world and emerging world. We already see that today. And to basically re-educate those masses of people will take a long time that we don't have. That doesn't mean it doesn't have to happen. But in my opinion, a direct change, a major change in carbon emissions is needed. The vast majority of carbon emissions are driven by fossil fuel use. That's undisputed internationally, I believe. And here the biggest players are countries like China, India, where currently there is a very large drive in electrifying the fleet of vehicles, and I think that will have a profound impact. What we drive here also has a profound impact. How we heat or cool our houses has a profound impact, and that is the only reason why I'm pretty adamant about not comparing our food choices to our choices of using fossil fuels, because there's no comparison between these two, particularly in a country like this one here.
Thank you.
Frank, you're the target here as well. So yesterday we heard a lot from many of the speakers that they had a beef with beef, that beef was a big problem from a GHG and land use perspective. Today you told us that beef only represents 4% of the US GHG emissions. And although you didn't say it, there's sort of an implication here that we don't really need to worry about beef consumption in the United States. The reason why it's so low in the US is because we assumed basically that grassland and land use of pasture land is free from a GHG perspective. But we also have to look at this from a system point of view. And 3 billion people are going to enter the global middle class. So we expect dairy and beef to go up by 78%. Now, all the pasture lands in the world are currently used. Yes, many of them are not used productively, so we absolutely have to be investing in the productivity of livestock, as you correctly pointed out. But even when we do that, even if we brought up all that productivity up to the US levels, we still cannot meet that 70% growing demand. So at the margin, it will continue to drive deforestation. So it's really important in high beef consumption countries like the US, the UK, and others that we have reductions in order to allow others to eat beef as they enter the global middle class and not have the deforestation that goes with it. Thank you.
Well, I think this is a very important point. By the way, I did not say that beef contributes to 4%, but all of livestock. So that's beef, dairy, sheep, pigs, and poultry, according to the EPA. These are direct emissions. If you look at direct and indirect emissions, you get closer to 5.5% or so of total emissions. Now, beef alone is an important driver of greenhouse gases, no doubt. The increasing demand will be significant globally, as you well stated. In my opinion, one of the greatest aspects of the beef carbon footprint globally is that of incredible inefficiencies in much of, particularly the developing world. While a beef steer in the United States is finished at 14 months of age, 1-4, his or her peer in Africa might live 10, 15, 20 years before it's harvested. So that directly drives environmental emissions, not just greenhouse gas emissions. I think that efficiencies are an incredibly important tool in reducing the global carbon footprint of livestock. It's not the only tool, but it is an important tool.
My point is, yes, we need that and we need the diet shifts too.
Yeah.
There's no discussion about that. I agree.
And can I also just add an equity perspective, even if livestock is from that estimate 5.5%, or agriculture is 5.5% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Our greenhouse gas emissions are massive, and so 5.5% of our emissions are probably larger than a lot of countries by themselves, and we've been emitting a lot for a long time, so there's a global equity issue there as well, and what I believe is an ethical obligation to reduce our emissions here, regardless of the breakdown by sector.
Dr. Heller, from your research looking at diet and climate change, do you have anything to add?
I think the question of whether focusing on, I think given the urgency of the situation, there isn't a single sector that is going to solve the problem. The focus needs to be on all of it. And that's a challenging situation in the current political climate that we find ourselves in, right? The one thing that I think we need to remember is it's possible. There is the potential for us to convert to 100% renewable energy economy globally. It's possible, right? But converting to a food system that has no emissions is probably going to be a bigger challenge. That's something to keep in mind, depending on where our end goals are. But I don't think there's a single solution in either direction. I think it needs to be efforts on all fronts to reach those goals.
Just a quick question also to Frank. I like that you tried to address sort of some of the inconsistencies, and I guess lots of that has to do with different perspectives, right? You highlighted that LCA studies had a certain perspective, and then you put forward the production-based perspective. I wonder how the EPA estimates would change if you consistently allocated everything with regards to consumption, because that would then be very consistently presenting those two perspectives.
With respect to consumption, what do you mean by that?
Basically an LCA perspective on all of those. So transport wouldn't appear then in a sense, right? Only when we buy a car. But food would be higher and so on, right?
And we'll need short answers, please, because we're up against the clock.
I don't think I have an answer because the way that EPA inventories all sectors is a certain way that's different from what you're suggesting. We could do this as an academic exercise, of course, and many of us do that. Look at those emissions, but that's not the direction the EPA would go. They just choose a different type of emission approach, assessing approach, and
internationally there is no now also though a push to sort of look at consumption-based emissions, right? Like the what is it? The CICERO from Norway. They're pushing that quite a bit, right? Anyway, I don't want to.
I'm more familiar with the production-based LCAs, and yeah.
Hi, Rebecca Boehm, University of Connecticut. I have a question for Dr. Blackstone about local and regional food systems. I think it's a really great way to promote sustainable diets, and I'm wondering if you have ideas for policies at the federal level to promote local and regional food systems to consumers to kind of drive demand for local food systems. And I bring it up because in the recent kind of Farm Bill negotiations, programs that support local food systems like the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Grant actually got more funding, is supported in a bipartisan way. So I don't know if local food systems could be what you think about including promotion of local food systems in the dietary guidelines or kind of ideas like that.
Yeah, really interesting point. I think we should absolutely continue the support that we have in the Farm Bill and other agricultural policies for our local and regional food systems. One thing I do want to point out, so SNAP redemption at farmers markets has been increasing over time. So folks who are on food stamps or SNAP in the United States can take their EBT cards and go to farmers markets and where they have portals and use them to get access to fresh fruits and vegetables. There was an announcement recently that the company that handles all of the transfers for EBT at farmers markets is no longer going to be operating. And so there are about to be a lot of farmers markets out of luck and unable to process food stamp benefits. So I think something that we could do, or that Congress could do now, is figure out a solution so that we continue to support this highly successful program that supports local healthy food access in low-income communities. I think that's one thing that's actually particularly urgent right now.
Thank you. I want to again thank all of the panelists for really excellent presentations. It truly shows the value of cross-disciplinary and cross-sector dialogue. I think we've all learned so much. I know I have. You've helped to highlight the energy that is going into developing new innovations across all sectors. And it's going to take that whole of society approach to really drive us to the change we need. So thank you again for your participation, and I'll turn it over to Sylvia.